We usually think a complex system only works perfectly when every single piece follows the exact same rules. But if you look closely at highly developed societies, we see the exact opposite happening. To stop everything from crashing, these systems constantly and rationally engineer exceptions to their own rules. In this explainer, we're going to map exactly how this happens. We start with a baseline that everyone basically accepts for stability: absolute equality. In its purest form, a system is built so the rules apply to absolutely everything, without exception. Nobody is above the mechanism. All inputs get processed identically. We assume this is the glue holding the whole structure together. But right away, a really disturbing contradiction pops up when the system is put under pressure. The architecture preaches absolute equality, sure, but it actively carves out these pockets of immunity. Why would a system built entirely on universal rules intentionally design structural blind spots? Just let that contradiction sit for a minute.
Take the 2024 Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity. Now, regardless of the politics, from a purely structural standpoint, this isn't an anomaly. It represents a system installing a necessary exception to prevent a total breakdown. When we strip away the personalities and look purely at the mechanics, the system recognized that subjecting its apex node to standard processing would crash the entire operation.
Part 1. The illusion of absolute rigidity. Picture a rigid mechanical sorting track. You've got items rolling down heavy metal rails, designed to treat everything equally with zero human intervention. This is the absolute ideal of automated governance. General rules, set in advance, treating every single unit with identical physical precision. The entire goal is to structurally engineer out human choice.
But what happens when something unprecedented hits that track? The rigid rails threaten to literally shatter. The infinite, unpredictable variables of reality just do not fit onto unbending metal. A rigid track can perfectly sort uniform boxes all day long, but it simply cannot process anomalies.
Part 2. When the mechanism jams.
Historically, keeping the system running meant severely limiting what human operators could do, forcing all items down that exact same unyielding track. The architecture was specifically built to minimize arbitrary power by structurally eliminating human choice. Every single thing had to fit the procedure.
However, as the sheer volume and complexity of the modern world exploded, strict adherence to these metal rails paralyzed the system. If every single decision, every permit, every regulation has to be formally processed through rigid central courts, this massive influx of variables creates inevitable gridlock. The machine seizes up completely.
Part 3. The necessity of the bypass. By 1941 in the United States, a structural compromise emerged because the central courts were just totally overwhelmed. The sheer volume of modern governance forced the system to evolve. To prevent a total shutdown, administrative agencies were brought in to process the overflow, effectively bypassing the traditional rails.
So the engineers of the system install manual bypass gates. Administrative discretion. This allows human operators to pull irregular items off the gridlocked track. It was a completely rational local optimization needed to keep the factory running. But structurally, it broke the architecture. That uniform metal rail was now permanently interrupted by human operators. Looking at this evolution on the timeline, we see a distinct structural escalation. 1215, Magna Carta limits power. 1885, strict legal equality. 1941, administrative discretion allowed. 2024, absolute executive immunity. Every step away from rigid equality was a necessary optimization to prevent collapse. The escape from rigidity just accelerates as complexity scales.
Part 4. The substantive complexity trap.
The track was suddenly forced to evolve from processing simple procedural rules into processing deep, complex, moral frameworks. The system started demanding that the track intrinsically protect abstract concepts, things like fundamental human rights, dignity, or international compliance. Because substantive concepts like human rights cannot be mechanically sorted by rigid rails, they strictly require human operators to evaluate them at those bypass gates. You cannot build a metal rail to mechanically sort fairness. These require a human mind to weigh the context. Discretion is no longer just a bypass. It becomes the core function.
And here is the catch. Attempting to make the system more perfectly just actually destroys the automated track entirely. By demanding the system process complex morality rather than simple procedure, the rigid automated rails dissolve into an endless series of manual gates. The system now structurally requires subjective human judgment just to function.
Part 5. The inevitable rule of man.
The physical, mechanical track was never capable of processing the infinite variables of a complex society. That contradiction we saw at the very beginning, it wasn't a flaw, it was a physical limit. Absolute equality on a fixed track guarantees catastrophic failure at scale.
To avoid total failure, the system had to structurally mandate immunities, exceptions, and bypasses. These aren't corruptions introduced by bad actors. They are the strictly necessary survival mechanisms of a system under immense load.
But every single exception installed replaces a rigid rail with a human operator making a subjective choice. To save the rule of law from collapsing under its own rigidity, the system structurally reintegrated the very thing it was originally built to eliminate, the rule of man.
Ultimately, the system wasn't corrupted by outside forces. It simply followed its own structure to its logical, inescapable conclusion. It optimized itself for survival, and in doing so, engineered its own end. The system was never failing. It was functioning exactly as designed.